Hi, everybody. Today's Facts in 5 video is about the potential risks of granting a life estate in real estate. So we do have a prior video on this channel about life estate, and it discusses mostly the upsides and the benefits as to why many people would want to grant a life estate. So that's not to say that there aren't good reasons to do a life estate. A lot of times it is a very beneficial planning tool, but I just also like to be very clear that it's not without risk. So the purpose of today's video is to go over what some of those risks are. But just quickly, what are those pros that I mentioned? What are the potential upsides? So a lot of times the hypothetical or the situation that we see where a life estate is being implemented is mom and dad come in to do their estate plan and decide there's some estate planning concerns that they have, either probate avoidance or long-term care costs. So they decide, let's give the house to, in this hypothetical, let's give the house to son and retain a life estate for ourselves. So what are the upsides? So one, it's not going to be a big financial burden on son, just because mom and dad are still going to be what are known as life tenants. And because of that, they're still going to be required to pay all the normal carrying costs associated with the house that they're likely already paying. So they're still going to be paying the taxes and the insurance and the utilities and all that. So it's not going to be a big financial burden on son just to name him or give him the house. And again, with mom and dad retaining the life use. Also, mom and dad won't have to have the property, or I should say the property won't have to pass through mom or dad's probate estates upon their deaths, just because probate is only required for assets that are individually owned by someone when they pass away. And in this event, mom and dad didn't own the house. They gave it away, retained a small ownership interest, but not enough to require the house to go through probate. And last but not least, a lot of times when we do a transfer like this, it's because mom and dad have long-term care concerns. They might be worried they're going to have to go into a nursing home and have to spend on all their money and not leave son any inheritance. So one thing they can do is transfer the house like this, give son the house, retain the life estate. So then if and when it becomes necessary to apply for Medicaid, so long as that transfer to son was made more than 5 years from the date that mom or dad applied for Medicaid. So what's known as that 5-year look back, if the transfer occurred outside that 5-year look back period, the house is also going to be protected for Medicaid eligibility purposes. So those are the upsides. So what are the downsides? Well, in that same hypothetical where mom and dad say, we want to avoid probate, we want to protect the house from long-term care costs, but there's some risk though with this transaction of giving the house to son. One is the house is now subject to son's potential creditors. One common one that we see, and one instance that most people don't think of as a creditor situation, but practically speaking, it is, son gets divorced and his now soon to be ex-spouse is trying to take him to the cleaners and take all of his assets. And his assets now include mom and dad's house. So is that automatically going to happen in a divorce? No, but is it a risk? Potentially. Also, let's say 2 years later, mom and dad say, you know what? We really want to move down to Florida. We don't like all this snow and ice up here in Connecticut. Let's sell the house and go buy a condo. And at that point, son says, well, I don't want to give you back my interest in the house. So if mom and dad move forward and sell the house, son is going to be entitled to a pretty hefty portion of the sale proceeds because he's the legal owner of a good percentage ownership of the house. So even if mom and dad sell, they're only getting a fraction of the actual value of the house because son is an owner as well. So that's a downside. You got to make sure that son in this hypothetical is going to be on board and willing to give you back or give mom and dad back their ownership interest of the house. So make sure that relationship is pretty stable there. Also, mom and dad will need to file a gift tax return because they did make a taxable gift. In 2023, any gifts over $17,000 to one person trigger the need to file a gift tax return. But as I discussed in my other life estate video, this is more of just a filing requirement than actually a need to come out of pocket and pay taxes, because instead of mom and dad paying any gift taxes, both the state of Connecticut and the federal government will simply reduce mom and dad's estate tax exemption in lieu, again, of that out-of-pocket tax being paid. And right now in both Connecticut and the federal government, the estate tax exemption in 2023 is just about $13 million. So a reduction of a $13 million exemption is likely not going to cause much concern. And also too, if mom and dad do need Medicaid, be aware that if they need to apply within that 5-year period, there is still that 5-year look back to contend with. Another potential con, and this comes up in maybe a slightly different hypothetical, is mom is married to husband number one, has son, husband number one passes away, mom gets remarried to husband number two, mom dies, and in mom's will, she leaves a life estate in the house to husband number two. Well, let's say husband number two and son really don't get along. And so husband number two says, kind of, the heck with you, son. I'm not paying any of these costs. I'm not paying the taxes and the insurance and, any repairs that need to be done because I just don't like you, or I just don't want to, or heck, I might not have the money to. So this is going to create all sorts of problems because those expenses are the life tenant's responsibility. So husband legally is supposed to be paying those. But if he doesn't or he won't, son is either going to have to come out of pocket to pay those expenses himself. If son doesn't have the money, the house is potentially going to fall into disrepair and become subject to liens for unpaid taxes and utilities and all those other things. Or two, if son has the money to do so, he can hire an attorney and try to essentially sue husband number two to force him to pay those costs. But now you're involved in a lengthy and expensive legal battle. So I also say, and this is a common planning tool too. Obviously, you want to ensure your spouse gets an opportunity to continue to live in the house after you pass away if they're not already an owner on the house. But again, think long and hard of, practically speaking, how that's going to work. So those are all the potential cons, or not all the potential cons, but some of the most common downsides potentially to using a life estate when it comes to estate planning. So please take all of those into consideration if you have implemented a life estate or thinking about implementing a life estate, just because it's not completely without risk.